Have quite a few people. We're going to go ahead and get started. So, first off, I want to welcome you from ISM-Chicago, and we have a very special guest in today, somebody that I've known for a couple years now and have actually worked together before and have seen his amazing teaching skills before. We have Ralph Carlton in, and he has a very fascinating experience history as well as some of the things that he's doing right now. And he's going to get into that in just a moment where he goes over a brief biography about himself. So you guys fully understand the expertise that is coming to the table today. If you've never attended a Humanizing Procurement series webinar before, what we're trying to do in this entire series, we're on part two. So we did part one last year, everyone. Part two is continuing on with the theme of understanding the people part of the purchasing side of the economy. And what I mean by that is we focus so much on the numbers sometimes, right? What can procurement do for the business from a numbers perspective only? But there's another element to that that makes strategic sourcing, supply chain, all that special. And that is the people portion, right? Everyone that's here in the space contributes so greatly to this that this entire series is about highlighting those strengths and those unique attributes that make them great. And this year, one of the things that we're focusing in on is the leadership aspect of procurement and the people part of that. How do we manage better? How do we grow better? And how do we lead better? And Ralph Carlton is the perfect person to have this session with us, and I'm super excited about that. So, without saying anything more, you guys have heard enough from me. I'm going to be the co-host today, asking him some questions, guiding us along here. But Ralph, you are the star of the show. I'm going to hand it on over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about what we're talking about today.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I couldn't be more excited to be here today with you all. As Brandon noted, we've worked together before, and it's been a conversation that we've had for some time to bring this together. So I currently serve as the Vice President of Global Procurement Enablement for a company called Thermo Fisher. Um, and I want to talk to you guys today about the fact that you can't fake influence. How do you master change management within what we call procurement transformations, all the things that we try to do differently, right? So, what I want to do over the next hour or so is give you a bit of my background to kind of set the baseline for why I'm going to be able to share with you some of those experiences. And then talk through some specific examples, speak through some specific examples of where I've driven transformations, some of those lessons learned, and how it's impacted the organization. And to Brandon's point, really focusing on the people, right? I'll give you the punchline. One of the things that I often say is that procurement is just as much sales and marketing as it is procurement, right? How do we ensure that we're driving that value proposition of trading what we know, what we can do for some level of value within the organization, and how do we continue to market what we do for the improvement of the organization? I won't drain this slide, I promise you. But from a bio perspective, I've been in industry of all things supply management for at least the last 22 years. I've had the good fortune of spending time originally as an engineer, materials engineer, where I did a rotation with General Motors, and then transitioning over to all things supply management, right? So I've had roles in a variety of industries like aerospace, automotive, technology, consumer products, doing everything that you can imagine, whether it be low cost country sourcing, cost management, supplier relationship management, supplier development, all the things that we think about that have really expanded who we are over the last 20 or so years within global procurement and global supply management. Because I often think about the fact that it's changed tremendously, right? The ask from the C-suite, the ask from our stakeholders, the ask both internally and externally has continued to expand. And I think that's something that we're all dealing with right now as the world around us continues to change, right? I've had specific focus in my career around strategy and data analytics, driving transformations, and ensuring that organizations have best practices. Okay. And I've also had the good fortune of not only leading supply management teams, but also leading engineering and quality teams, right? So that's helped us along with operations. So that's helped, shape my purview relative or in perspective relative to that teamwork, the silos. How do we go from an end-to-end view of really driving value within the organization. From an education perspective, as I mentioned, I am an engineer, but then from the University of Michigan. But then I also went and completed my MBA in supply chain and operations management from Wayne State University, the Ilitch College of Business in Detroit, Michigan. Now, I consider myself a lifelong learner. I think in order for us to be successful, we have to continue to sharpen those tools, to reinvigorate who we are, both mentally as well as, emotionally and physically, to bring the best value of ourselves so that we can show our authentic selves and our true strengths within organizations. So I've had the good fortune of being involved with a variety of programs and certifications, whether it be the fact that I'm a Six Sigma Black Belt, as this is, we have a lot of ISM representation. I am a CPSM, and truly support the development through that program and the work that's done there, and the skill set that it brings relative to giving a well-rounded perspective of all things supply management. Early on in my career, I realized that while I tried to escape all things finance, that it's difficult to be successful within the global supply management world without having a view of finance, without understanding what finance means within running a business and how we relate it to supply management. So I completed a certificate program, Finance for Non-Financial Managers, at Cornell University, and then also working through a variety of leadership programs. The leadership experience for advanced development at Case Western Reserve University, in Cleveland, Ohio, and then participating in the McKinsey and Company Black Executive Leadership Program. So that just gives you a bit of a flavor of how I've chosen to continue to expand my knowledge base throughout my career. And then
Ralph,
really,
that is amazing.
oh,
I
sure.
just want to make a quick comment here. Well, first, thank you so much for that. This really is a testament to the fact that you are a lifelong learner, but you've also been in some very unique positions as a leader to see some amazing transformations and evolutions within the procurement space over the last 22 years, I believe you said, which is just fantastic levels of experience all around. I'm extremely impressed. I see why you get the job. Let me put it that way. Um, a question about this though, like if you had to, because part of what I'm thinking about where people on the call right now might be thinking to themselves is, I want to be in this guy's shoes one day. What is one thing that you can say from your experience that has impacted your ability to advance the most throughout your career? If you could just point to one thing. I know that's very difficult, but what comes to mind when you say, "Hey, this made the most impact for me for my upward mobility in that space"?
Yeah, I would say being keenly and directly focused on solutions, right? No matter the problem, no matter the issue, you're focused on developing the solution to the problem and executing toward it, right? So I've always taken my career and opportunities from a solutions management type of viewpoint, so that regardless of what's going on around us, I could focus on how do we bring people together to align on the solution? How do we develop the execution path for the solution? And how do we deliver whatever we said we would do relative to that solution within the business? And then that has become, I guess, my calling card, relative to being able to help me progress in my career, whether it be through internal movements within an organization or being poached and pulled into other opportunities, and building that repertoire and that track record that others could evaluate.
I love to hear it, Ralph. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, we can move
Absolutely.
on whenever you're ready.
Sure. And so just to kind of give a bit of color to my background, I look at this with pride. I think early on, when I started my career, I grew up in the sense of you stay with one company your entire life, but I've had the good fortune of having a variety of experiences, and those experiences have been across industries and across the globe, right? So I've lived in Mexico. I've worked extensively in Southeast Asia and throughout Europe. And I think that's helped to shape my perspective on just what Brandon and I were speaking on relative to how do you drive solutions, right? You have to think about it globally as well as locally, right? So think globally, act locally as a part of some of those items, and recognizing where you fit within the organization and how you can bring that solution space to a variety of those organizations. So hopefully some of these names resonate, especially for those of you in the Chicago area, Moen and Fortune Brands based in Deerfield, Illinois, just continuing to grow from there. Right. So, as I stated earlier, what I wanted to do is to provide everyone, as we talk about influence, as we talk about change management and this word of transformations, what has it meant through my career? So I have about 3 slides that I just want to highlight a few things and maybe open up for discussions or questions from the audience or from Brandon relative to how this fits within the theme. So how I want to set up the slide. To the right, this is when I was at Moen and Fortune Brands, as well as Masco, Fortune Brands, their number one competitor, with a problem statement that really challenged both organizations. And it was they had done work with a variety of consultants who provided feedback to them that where they were on their supply management journey was not the most mature. There was a lot of room for them to grow. They were leaving a lot of opportunities on the table relative to cost savings, relationship management, and everything around them was changing. So this was let's take ourselves back to the 2010 through 2018 time period, maybe, right? You saw a change in China, right? Where we were becoming more focused on, how the dollar versus the RMB was performing. We were starting to look more at supply base and the supply base risk relative to having suppliers, your supply base 90% installed within China. Cost management was becoming even more of an opportunity in an area that procurement was being asked to do more to support. And of course, how we drive innovation. All of these things were areas that we saw as challenges within the organization that procurement, supply management wasn't able to answer yet. And then when we dug a little deeper, we were seeing that within the organization, there were a variety of functional silos. What does that mean? Engineering did their own thing. Procurement sourcing did their own thing, right? Even supply management, supply chain management, the folks that are placing the POs and dealing with the suppliers on a daily basis, they had their own view and desires and opportunities, and there was no linkage or flow. And then we also had corporate structure changes, right? Where Moen went from being privately held to a public company, or with Masco, acquisitions and things of that nature. So all of these changes were happening, and the question was supply management. What can you do differently? So through all of those discussions, through all of those opportunities, that opportunity landed at my feet. And embracing the challenge is probably one of the top 5 that I probably would have answered Brandon with had he given me an opportunity to say more than one item. But embracing that challenge, right? And so in terms of driving the transformation, there were a few things that we had to do. How do we make sure that as we look at the change that needs to happen, we're absolutely aware of who we are? Where's that look in the mirror? And as procurement professionals, we have to be able to, I use this term, and it's probably not a popular one, but say when your baby is ugly. You have to say, this is who we are as an organization, but this is who we aspire to be over the course of X, Y, or Z time period and with A, B, or C investment, right? Assess where our strengths are, get alignment, get our stakeholders to believe. So doing that work, during that pre-work to see what they believe and think as well, right? And then attach to it. That drives the value proposition. When you are aware and you have the ideas that how others also see your function or your organization, it allows you to then start to create your strategy on where you want to drive attack, where you want to attack for opportunity, right? The value proposition. How can I say to another party, we recognize that this is an area that we could do better and we can bring more value in, and if we work together, or if we're given the opportunity to make these changes, this is how we can help the organization flourish, right? Driving better communication and transparency throughout the organization. Okay. While it's important for us to do the things that we're contracted to do or expected to drive within an organization, it does not preclude us from ensuring that we're bringing others with us along the way, right? So having those races, having that transparency, those updates relative to how we can keep everyone aware of what we're doing to slow down some of the questions, to slow down, with these functional silos, the tendency for others to say, I'll just do my own thing, right? That was really important. And then finally, driving executional excellence. There was a period in my career where I got a chance to do ISO auditing. And we would always say what you do what you say. So if I say I'm going to deliver something or I'm going to improve on something, it's important that at the end of that period, we're actually doing that, right? Now, what were the outcomes of all of that? A lot of words, right? Well, number one, we were able to drive 3x the cost savings over a period of time that we'd ever seen before. We were able to expand on our partnerships with our suppliers. So as we talked about risk management, the changes because of that visibility, it was both internal and external, right? We were able to make some changes and drive some true value on how we approach risk management, how we saw the competitive landscape, and we had a higher level of functional partnership. Engineers were no longer seen as a threat to what we wanted to do to supply management, but enablement, right? We became recognized as a leader in supply risk management, not only within Moen, but we got to expand that to some of our sister companies within Fortune brands, right? And then global sourcing, you always hear this thought about, I want a seat at the table. I look at that a little differently. It's not about just sitting there. It's about having a voice. It's about being part of the decision making. And this is through our work over this time period, we were able to make global sourcing a part of the decision making structure within the organization. And then I want to be redundant here, right? We drove executional excellence. We said what we were going to do, and we actually went above that. And so by doing that, we were able to really influence others that we were there to be partners, but that if given the opportunity, or sometimes taken the opportunity, we were going to bring value back to the organization. And it's transformed totally how both of these organizations, both the Masco, specifically Liberty Hardware, and Fortune Brands, specifically Moen, work within their organizations. So I'll pause there for any questions, comments, or concerns.
So, quick question, Ralph. I'll start off here, and anybody else, please feel free to put questions in the comment or use one of the reactions to raise your hand if you want to turn your camera off and ask a question. But, Ralph, as I'm listening to the story, part of my mind goes to a place of how can I replicate some of the successes here? And my thought then says, how does this in action look like? And I want to give a quick example, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong, or rather correct this. But pretty much what you're saying is if you're going through a change management process and you do things like create RACI forms or improve the communication, which is one of the solutions to the problem of working in silos, right? That you're able to do things like, but you talk about getting to the 3x financial results, right? And I'm trying to link that start to the financial result. Is the thought that those come from engineers being better involved in things like RFPs, or are they giving better feedback from the suppliers? Are they being used to negotiate better deals that then drive other cost savings? Are they getting involved earlier on deals because of the communication? So I guess from that point, help me understand where the financial impact comes from in that change management process.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the word and, right? So
Mhm.
you were asking initially, I think it's all of those things and then some, right? So the first part of driving this is really listening, going out to your stakeholders and just hearing how they see our solution space, how they see our space as driving opportunities, where they believe, there's help needed or things can be done differently, and establishing that needs versus wants. When I go further down, and I think the change management approach in the middle of the slide kind of at a very high level puts together that process for everyone, right? The
Mhm.
foundational awareness, so know who you are, know how others see you, right? How you show up, driving the communication. And then before you get to executional excellence, coming up with that strategy to go do, right? And then probably doing some do loops relative to communication and transparency. Relative to driving the financial pieces, yes, it is doing all of those things internally with engineering, but creating the process, right? A lot of the times with engineering, and a lot of organizations are set up like this, where engineering has their savings, sourcing has their savings. Well, how do we bridge that, right? We're all going to the same bank of X, right? And X being our company. So how do we spearhead, being partners? The other piece is Well, there's a lot that we can do internally with, like you said, bringing our engineers with us, starting earlier in the process. Even if I think about new product development, bringing sourcing in much earlier in the phase gate process than some companies have it, right? I think it's also looking externally, asking some of these same questions and working with our supply partners. I remember very vividly, I was in China working with a supplier. I was in Zhuhai, China, working with a supplier, and we kept saying, you're one of our largest suppliers. How do, and you also support not only us, but our competitors. How do we do things differently? Right. And they
Hmm.
were very open. They said, are you ready to listen? Because we've shared with you previously, or when I say you, your organization previously, how your way of working inhibits and excludes us from driving greater cost savings, right? So
Hmm.
by listening differently, by setting up programs, both internally and externally to help take advantage of changing process, really opens up that ability to drive that 3x cost savings, as well as getting alignment with finance, right? We talk about engineering, but I truly believe you unlock a
Mm.
lot of those things by looking at some of your other partners like finance, whether it's aligning on what counts as a cost savings, whether it's aligning, especially in the volatile environment that we're in, making changes to some of those rules, right? Which I've had to do in other organizations as we look at inflation and things like that. So those are all areas where you can dive deeper
Right.
and use terms like peeling the onion back, right? So design for cost, design for manufacturability, asking more questions that eventually will provide better answers.
Exactly. One other quick question that came in from the audience right now. Dan asks, how do you prioritize where you start?
So I generally look at a couple of things. First, I listen to the organization, right? My CEOs, my COO, CPO, everyone, and I build this list of what I think I've heard, right? I also look at risk. So I look at a variety of things that are going on in each organization, and it's a bit of a here's what I heard and here's where I think it shows up. And I put that list together of priority, but then I'm going to take it back to the stakeholders and drive that communication and get their feedback. I believe that these are our biggest priority, our largest priorities and why. And this is where they show up in the business and not being afraid to get feedback so that we're all on the same page. All too often, we create our own list of priorities and we hoard it. Yes, I'm going to do these things. And what happens is we get halfway through the year, we get three-quarters of the way through the year, and you learn that the organization had a different set of priorities. So, how
Hmm.
do I build followership? How do I build alignment, right? I share that priority list and be okay and be ready to either debate, but then ultimately align on what that priority should be. I mean,
Right.
I think we're all dealing with the fact that we have way more priorities than number of hours and minutes in the day, right? So saying, hey, I know that I have 42 priorities, but these are my top five. Are we aligned on that? Right? And I think that helps out tremendously. Thank you, Dan.
Wonderful, Ralph. Really appreciate that. We'll move on to the next one. And while you're doing that, I just want to call out Sean's comment here that just really talks about listening to suppliers. It's an obvious concept, but it can be difficult for some companies to listen to their suppliers and to have a true partnership. It needs to be that two-way conversation. So thank you very much for that comment there, Sean.
Sean couldn't be more right. It's challenging because I think we're in a very unique position as supply management professionals, right? We're in the middle. We're defending our organizations and we need to do right by our organizations, but we also recognize that we aren't always listening or being the best partners to our suppliers. And how do we bring that information back, right? And so being very comfortable with being in the middle, being very comfortable with ambiguity sometimes, I think makes for a great leader within supply management. So the next example is really my time at Stanley Black & Decker. I served as the vice president of global supply management there. And what we saw were a variety of changes in the C-suite. And I bring that up from an environmental perspective because that brings new ideas, new perspectives, new priorities for an organization. And you have to have that sensitivity of what your organization is looking for. We were dealing with the changing landscape, so dealing with inflation. This is around the time of COVID, okay? So very focused on cost management and supply assurance. Still dealing with functional silos. And with these changes in the C-suite, we're also looking at our corporate structure changing, groups moving between others, acquisitions, mergers. So all of those things became extremely important to really understand what we wanted to do, right? Lots of investment in tools. So once you make those investments, it's how do I understand, am I getting that ROI? Same thing here, though, very similar. How do we have that reflection and communication? We were dealing with a decentralized company. However, our procurement was centralized, right? So you couldn't necessarily say everyone go do. And this is where that sales and marketing mantra comes out that I shared with earlier, because we had to get followership. We had to get people, different divisions to buy in to what we were doing and why. It never escapes us that stakeholder engagement and management is key. I spent a lot of time in my role explaining the change and setting the expectations, and then showing how we were driving value on a continuous basis with the leaderships within all of the divisions. So that communication and transparency became really key. Now, one thing that we have to think about is how quickly do we do these things? I don't think many executives or many organizations have, great tolerance for really long projects that they have to wait for that return on. Okay. So how do we look at the actions versus words, right? Our say-do ratio. That becomes vitally important. I remember working with one of my mentors. He was the president of one of the divisions, and he says, Ralph, I love the strategy, but we need to make the year, right? So finding that balance of what good and great is going to look like over this horizon, but also understanding how am I going to deliver certain things over a specified period of time. And that's where the executional excellence comes into play. So our outcomes through all of this, during COVID, we were actually able to drive 5% productivity, right? Which I think was extremely exceptional. It took a lot of work internally and externally to drive. We leveraged and implemented tools that allowed us to get the visibility that we needed for success, and we stood up a supply chain risk management program using a specific system. We were able, through that process of transparency and showing what we were trying to do, we expanded the tent of things that global supply management was responsible for. And then above all, at the end of the year, we were still driving executional excellence. We could hang our hats on the fact that through the work that we were doing, we were still able to bring the value that the organization expected. And you see that relative to some of the, if you measure through stock, if you measure through if we met the year relative to our annual goals and things of that nature. So I'll pause there for reflection or questions.
There are going to be a couple questions here, Ralph. So we got a couple that came in from the chat, but I want to start off with one point that kind of leads into a few things. And then the discussion in the chat, I kind of want to ask you a few things that are centered around that. So first, overall question here. You talked about the importance of being able to influence your stakeholders properly, getting the followership kind of in line with some of your goals. How do you do that? Right? And what's the most effective way? Imagine you're a new leader, right? This is your first time being a senior director and you have to go through this. What do you tell that person in that role?
I'm going to tell you that was probably one of the most humbling experience of my career. Because imagine, as a newly minted vice president, I have to go into this room with presidents, VPs, CFOs, and say, "Stop what you're doing. Here's what we're going to do," right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I tried to do in that, and what my approach was to say, "Here's what I know. Here's what I believe to be true." And being very open and transparent with this may or may not be the case, but this is how we see it, and showing the data that supported it. And then I showed where we want it to be, where we ultimately saw ourselves, right? And then highlighted the bridge and the expectations for the timeline, right? Like, what can we expect by when through doing this? I was very upfront with where I saw risks and opportunities and help needed. I mean, think about that. That is the natural progression of any conversation that you have when you ask for something. And you're just doing it in a different environment, and you're tying it to, how you want to drive supply management. I can tell you, going through that process a series of times, it wasn't always comfortable, right? So this is where I said you had to humble yourself, because you're going to hear some things. about how you've been doing, how you've been operating, or if they see things something really different, but being open to making adjustments, understanding when you go into these conversations, like any negotiation, that there are certain things that you can't give on and certain things that are going to be a bit more gray that you can, and having that open dialogue and then committing at the end of the day to what that plan is going to be. And I think that was absolutely helpful for me. It took some time to get comfortable with that space, Brandon.
Right.
I won't sit here and state that it was perfect right off the bat. There are a lot of times that I knocked my head on the wall, but what I can say though is through that experience and putting that process together, it's helped me throughout the rest of my career and having those conversations.
So if I could oversimplify it, right?
Sure.
You walk in where the executive is, you say, hey, here are the problems that I've identified. Here's the path forward to solving those problems. Here are the risks if we take this path forward. But ultimately, at the end of the day, here are the outcomes. Do you want to come along on the ride with me? And do you see any problems with this plan? Is that kind of that in a
That's fair.
nutshell?
That's fair. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Yeah, in my mind, I'm also trying to create a cheat sheet on how do we guide and have these conversations. If I'm ever in this situation, what do I need to think about? And kind of like what you said, if this person's, hey, here's how I follow my logic, imagine it's a normal conversation. But we have another question from Eileen
And,
Weathers, who
and
says,
Brandon, before we go to Eileen's question, the one thing that
sure.
I would add, and I often tell my teams this, is you have to be able to see around the corner. What I do in preparing for that conversation is I put myself in that stakeholder shoes. What do they care about? What do they want to hear and why? What's important to them? And that helps me put together the structure for that conversation. I think that the more
Exactly.
that we see ourselves in the other person's shoes, the more we can understand their perspective. And I think that also goes to any of the negotiations that we do externally or internally. Thank you for letting me interject.
No, 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 100%. The quick example that comes to mind for me is when I was serving kind of in an IT director role or IT procurement director role, and I was having conversation with the CIO, and we were talking about our project plan moving forward. And I said, well, I'm bringing to you the cost savings plan. And then she said, Brandon, anything involving cost savings, I want you to remove because it's not part of my plan. Here's what I want. And it's counterintuitive to procurement to say we're not going to focus on that. But kind of what you're saying is, you need to focus and align on what other leaders in the organization want and to adjust and be dynamic in having those conversations with them. We can't stronghorn in certain things like that if it's completely off their agenda, which may be like I said, counterintuitive to our first thought there.
Absolutely.
Um, so with Eileen's question here, she says, how can supply chain or procurement professionals effectively leverage data analytics and or data management systems to manage change or address pain points, specifically where data integrity is an issue? It's a really good question.
I love that question. It's almost as if Eileen has already seen my presentation because that's what we're going to talk about in the next slide. Number one, data is what's going to drive everything that we do, right? Alignment on where the data comes from, how the data is used, etc., makes for success, right? I think those questions relative to data quality, those questions relative to, I always say, so what do you do with it, is going to be key. This is where aligning with your stakeholders, right? In this case, in a lot of cases, finance, when we look at data items, IT on the how we're going to get data, even your suppliers to ensure that our data is correct, or other organizations within your business is really key. And it's almost, what I didn't share with you as an engineer, I'm a math guy, right? So I think of theorems and proofs and how we solve equations. I think that's the thing with data, right? We have to say, listen, we want to get to this. We want to look at our global spend as an example across our organization. Well, in order to get to global spend, we need to look at all of these different areas in order to generate that information. And we have to be able to align with those partners within the organization that they see it the same way. We have to be able to show, whether through flowchart or SOPs or whatever it may be, that here is our process that we want to take, and we need to validate it and pressure check it, and also make sure others are able to do that, and then show the outcomes of that. Now, getting the data is one thing. What we do with it is a very different item. And that's why I pivoted to this particular slide, because in a nutshell, when I was with Velcro as the vice president of global procurement, we again saw from external parties that we had gaps in maturity. We were dealing with tariffs. We were dealing with the dollar value. We were dealing with cost management as a whole and innovation. Still had those issues with functional silos. And the reality is, the business and what they needed and wanted to be successful had outgrown what procurement was actually delivering. And
Hmm.
so within that, when I started to do that reflection, when I started to engage with the suppliers and have those conversations, I quickly noted that data was a problem. And I'll give you a really quick example. When I joined on day one as vice president, the first thing that I asked is, can someone generate a spend report for me? I like to see my suppliers. I'd like to see where we're doing business and with whom. It took 3 weeks to get that information. I immediately knew we had a data issue, because as I started to push on why, right? For all my Six Sigma friends, the five whys, right? It was, well, we're not aligned, or we don't know, or this system isn't talking to this system, right? And so within that, this is what kicked off us starting a data analytics program and bringing in talent, showing the opportunity, getting buy-in from the organization that we should invest in data analytics, because we said these are all the nodes of information that we're missing. This is what we want to be able to do. And we attached it to tariff management, inflation, and driving cost savings. We said that we'd be able to move faster through that. What we ultimately found and what we're able to prove was that by putting resources in data analytics, showing what we could do, and then getting the executional excellence part of getting results from that, we were able to drive financial results that gave us the highest productivity we have seen in the history of the organization. And I'm talking Velcro, the sticky stuff team, the stuff that we all are familiar with. It was in 2020 or so that we started to see some of the highest cost savings year over year, right? And that's continued to be a trend for us. So much that the procurement team at Velcro was recently recognized by ISM, I think, last year, for having an award-winning data analytics program, right? So this is where you see the beauty of having that conversation around data analytics as an opportunity, but being able to show where you're going to have impact and then bringing that forward. So I'll pause there for questions and reflection.
No, this is fantastic, Ralph. And as I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat right now and hearing some of your stories, there seems to be a very big link between, well, one, how do we treat our stakeholders? And the first part is understand where those pain points are and then develop a path for that solution. And I love your story about data because at a point, you're the primary stakeholder, and that was then a pain point for you that was then identified to be linked to other pain points throughout the company, and you were able to say, how do we, and we kind of take out the term kill two birds with one stone. So we're going to feed two birds with one seed, right?
I
And
like
how
that.
do you then connect that back to, hey, if we get better data, better, I guess, controls within our system, how do we not only solve our problems, but enable us as a procurement organization to better solve our stakeholder problems? And
Mhm.
they're worried about tariffs, inflation, and a ton more things that you then are able to better leverage and situate yourself to manage. So, one of the things that I want to kind of address here is how we treat suppliers, right? So there's been some conversation in the chat. Chris Cooley had made a very good statement where he talked about treating suppliers like customers. And often when I talk to different procurement teams, and sometimes I say, hey, bring me up your best negotiator. And then I say, tell me about your strategies. Often they're saying, well, I'm really tough on my suppliers, right? I force them to do what I want, and we get the most out of them that way. And they're just great providers in this way. You've described your process with suppliers and internal stakeholders slightly differently, maybe kind of closer to what Chris is saying, which is treat them like a customer. What is your approach, your general approach? You can tell me about whatever important piece you think is most relevant, but I want to hear how you feel about supplier management in the world of change management.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. So I don't know if you picked up on it, but I would often interchange the word suppliers for supply partners, right?
Mm,
Throughout our talk, because I think when you just say suppliers, just in general, it already sets a hierarchy of I'm here, you're here, right? When the reality is you're supply partners, right? We both have something that we want to get out of the relationship. So changing the perspective of the relationship really, really matters. And I found my grandmother's from Alabama. She would always say, you catch more bees with honey than vinegar, right? I've
yeah.
often found that when I start the relationship with a perspective of trust, clarity, transparency, let me share with you my needs and wants. I also want to hear your needs and wants, right?
Hmm.
I found that that's worked. Now, the reality is every relationship is going to be different depending on what type of relationship it is, what they want out of the relationship. So recognizing, and I think of some of the ISM teachings on the Kraljic matrix and looking at strategy, right? It's not only what you want, but also taking a gander at to what they want to get out of the relationship becomes really, really key and an effective tool. In doing that, you're able to synthesize and really cut through a lot of the minutia of I need to be tough all the time and I need to have a bravado or a persona. And I can versus being able to say, here's where I'm at. This is what I need. How do we get there? Right. And you
Yeah.
have to apply that differently because every relationship is going to be different. But you also have to realize you're probably going to need your suppliers to show up differently a lot more than they'll need you. Right. Your suppliers consistently need you to place orders and pay them right? But we need them to provide quality products at on a service level that we anticipate and to also mirror some of the things that we're going through, right? So whether it be volume fluctuations, whether it be information grabs, right? Think of right now for all of us that are facing tariffs, right? We have to go get a lot of information from our supply partners to understand exactly what our risk and opportunity is, right? And then
Hmm.
start these conversations on mitigations. We also have to talk to our suppliers differently, whether it comes to hey, we got a new goal on cost savings. We got a new goal on sustainability, right? We are changing, and how do we bring them along for that ride, right? And this is where, as we approach them in certain ways and make them a part of the solution and not just a problem, I think we get a lot more out of it. Now, don't get me wrong. There are times when you have to be a bit more forceful relative to needs and wants, but I tell you, if you approach the relationship from a higher level, when you do have to go down that path of being a bit more directive and expecting, it carries more weight, it has more
Hmm.
influence, right? And that's really important because we as negotiators have to look at the total relationship. And we don't want our voices to be drowned out by being playing the same beat over and over again, where our supply partners then tune it out.
Wonderful, Ralph. I have two more questions. We have about 15 minutes or so left. I just want to make sure we can get through these. So what if we do like two speed questions, if you don't mind? The first one I'm going to ask is from Dan Martin here. I'm going to slightly rephrase this and say, from a supplier partner perspective, right? How often should you be, and this is, I think, better for us from a technical standpoint, right? Let's say you're designing a procurement policy and you're telling your team you've got these strategic partners. How often are you going to direct your team to be meeting with some of those supplier partners? And then how often do you think that the business should also meet with them, just from a general standpoint?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of quarterly reviews,
Uh-huh.
especially with my partners, right? And we're talking about landscape changes, opportunities, things of that nature from a procurement supply management perspective. I like to bring in other functional leaders in the business on an annual basis, and that's generally just with my strategic partners, because I think we use the word strategy in the wrong way. Strategic partners actually means shared risk and reward. So these are the supply partners that I'm going to share a bit more information and I'm going to expect a bit more from them as well relative to how we compete, what we do differently, and how they bring some additional value to the organization.
Wonderful. I like that a lot. So essentially, procurement, we should be having these strategic meetings with our partners quarterly, but we should be getting the business involved at a strategic planning level at least annually with those strategic partners.
Absolutely. And then
Wonderful.
let performance kind of guide us if we need to speak more regularly on other topics.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And then my second question is much more of a scenario-based situation. Let's say you've stepped into an organization and you have a very key supplier come to you and then say to you, "Hey, Ralph, we made a bad deal with your predecessor, right? We didn't understand what we were signing up for, and now we're in a really tough position where the deal that we have with you is actually losing us money." What sort of approach from a change management perspective do you take with that? Is that a situation, from the win-win perspective? Do you start over? Do you get rid of the deal? Do you get rid of the supplier? What do you do when a supplier says, "Hey, we had a bad deal with the person that was here before you"?
Yeah, so unfortunately, you didn't just pull this one out of the sky. This happens more often than I think a lot of us will care to admit. I
I may
think you
have been asking for a friend. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Like I think you have to do your homework, right? You have to really understand the why from their perspective and get really comfortable with the information that they're sharing, but understand the impact within your organization. And then from there, from a negotiations perspective, what else do we want out of the supply partner that we're not getting?
Hmm.
And then having frank conversations relative to you want us to do this change, but this is how it impacts us. And I start to build my whys, like what else can I get out of it? And think about it. If you're asking those internal questions from your stakeholders and you're sharing this information that they want to exit, a particular agreement, you should probably be building, well, if they do this, how does this impact us? But what are other things that we can ask for? And in being in that situation, I had that when I joined an organization, the supplier, my first week, they said, "Hey, we agreed on this. We don't agree anymore. We're going to stop shipping."
Hmm.
So we had to very quickly start to do just what I explained. And while we had to change our profile on cost savings, right? They were supposed to give us so many percent cost back per year. We actually delayed it for a year to give them some level of hope. But then there were some other asks that we went for, whether it be, payment terms, extension of productivity. We changed the scale a bit. We also got them to agree because they shared innovations with us and our competitors that we would get first right of refusal for a lot of innovation. So never let a good crisis go to waste, right? Always think about what else can I get out of this while it may be uncomfortable and not what we anticipated. What if? What's the art of possibility? And I think that's what we're tasked with as supply management professionals. We have to be uber creative with how we want to solve problems and being solutions focused because there's more than one way to get to where we want to go at the end of the day.
Wonderful, Ralph. Really appreciate that. Fantastic. All right, I think we're ready to move on then.
So I just wanted to open it up for pure discussion. I've enjoyed sharing with you all some of my experiences, but if there's anything else, that we can talk about, I'd love to use that time for that. Either my experiences in corporate America or my experiences through the career in driving those transformations.
Yeah, so we'll leave the chat open. And then also, anybody, if you would like to turn your camera off, maybe say something or ask a question directly, we have time for a little bit of that. Just use the reaction emoji to raise your hand or just start with turning your camera on and then we can see you. But yes, everybody, we have about 10 more minutes or so left with Ralph. So there is a question in, I believe this is going to be from Dan. Have you ever worked for a company that deployed Toyota production system?
I have, I have, and as a Six Sigma, I get excited about that. Um, it's it's what I would say. You have to think about all of the pieces of TPS that you want to add and why. If I think back to my history when we've tried to drive TPS into organizations, a lot of the times we pick the pieces and parts that we think are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck. And where I've seen companies not do well with TPS is they don't always pick the pieces that tie into one another. So, for the sake of time, and Dan, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn or something. What I've always said is make sure that as you lay out the Toyota production system, you have a real understanding of what it is you want to drive and implement within your organization, and what are some of the foundational elements that you need in order to make that successful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ralph. I just want to also acknowledge a few comments here. Jennifer Grimes talks a little bit about the meetings with suppliers can also be based on how much is in their new product launch and how much their current spend is. but always wants to find out new capabilities from suppliers. So really did like that comment there. And also just comments and says that your outtake on supplier management or the relationship and dialogue between strategic partners is a refreshing take on things. So I really agree, and that's kind of why I asked certain questions here because I'm wondering, because we don't just have procurement people on the call right now. We also have some people that would consider themselves on the supplier side. And I
Mhm.
often get a lot of feedback if I ever take the win-win approach with suppliers. Many of them say it's the first time that they're being considered in such a way, right? When it comes to, we have one other question that might have just come in here, but I wanted to ask very quickly overall, for your leadership style and the culture that is typically impacted when a new leader takes hold of the situation. What's important to consider as you try to transform the way that the mindset and the culture of the people that you're now leading? And part of the reason I asked that question is if you've ever stepped into a relatively the environment is hostile towards suppliers and you're trying to change that, what do you often have to do first?
Yeah, so my leadership style is one of servant leadership, right? I like to push my team out front and ensure that I'm there for my team to help their growth, development, career aspirations, personal, professional opportunities, right? I am a roll your sleeves up type of person. So I've never felt comfortable leading from an ivory tower. If I ask someone to do it, I'm probably right along with them trying to figure it out. I'm not a big fan of titles, right? So unless someone has my business card or has looked me up, you really don't know my title because I think it's more important the how we're going to do something than the what rather than the who. I think by employing that and by ensuring that my teams and my supply partners recognize that I enjoy debate, I enjoy the opportunity to find different solutions. And that's really my starting point. I think it allows for more fruitful dialogue. I think it allows for us to be a bit more transparent and authentically us relative to how we want to solve problems. Because the reality is, again, there are more problems than there's time, right?
Mhm.
And so we probably spend more time with our coworkers and our suppliers than sometimes we do, just in solo time or with our friends and family. So it's important that that type of structure is set. And I think it gets more buy-in both internally with your partners that you work with, but also externally with your supply partners. And, when I either do new leader assimilation or I bring on new teams or join new teams, that's one of the key messages that I like to drive forward so that there's an absolute understanding relative to approach and expectation. And it doesn't change, right? Like the Ralph that you all see today is the same Ralph that you'll deal with in a meeting, the same Ralph that you'll deal with in a supplier visit, an ISM conference, etc. Right? So that's
Wonderful.
the approach.
I really do like that, Ralph. A quick question here, coming in from Dan Martin, I believe. What are you reading right now? Or what do you like to read typically?
So I was just sharing this with Brandon before the webinar. Right now, I've been reviewing "Fire the Boss, Keep the Love," which is a book by Nassim Malik. 10 jobs, 10 exits, 10 lessons. I recommend it because as someone who's maneuvered through the journey of building my career, I think it gives a lot of perspective and feedback from other leaders, and specifically Nassim who lived in the greater Chicago area on how to navigate all of the challenge and change that organizations have. I I I have a wide variety of things that I'm interested in. So right now I'm reading a lot on just globalization. A book that I just reread was Mr. China, which I thought was really good because it just talked about the early aspects of organizations moving into China at the beginning of this more globalization view. A lot on sports. I'm a Detroit everything fan. So anything around sports, you name it, I'm into it, right? I'm also spending a lot of time reading about volleyball rules as my daughter's a volleyball player. So,
Wonderful, 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 Ralph. Another question from Eileen. Given the range of organizations within your experience, what were some examples of unique issues facing supply chain or procurement organizations? So, for example, semiconductor, automotive, medical device, etc.
Yeah. So what was what's interesting is I often went into these organizations thinking issues would be unique. I often went into these organizations and everybody believes that their issue is unique to that particular company. And I always kind of laugh because the reality is we are so similar, right? Nobody has all the tools. No one has the market cornered on, how to deal with supply partners or function or silos within the functions. So it's actually the reverse, Eileen. It's actually the fact that the problems that we're all facing are very similar to the problems that so many others are facing. And probably, going into organizations like, oh, I came from a small company, now I'm at this huge global company. The problems are going to be different, exact same. So that's probably how I would approach that one. But being open-minded,
Mhm.
recognizing that the problems are different, being sensitive to people's experiences or organizations' experiences, but also being solutions focused was really key for me throughout my career.
And another question around that. So, we've gotten into conversations before about our experience. Both you and I have experiences at different companies and different industries. And I would 100% agree with you in terms of a lot of the things that you'll experience from procurement department to procurement department are relatively similar. But let's say we have somebody on the call now who is telling themselves, I need to make a switch or I want to get into a different industry. Maybe I was in retail before, and now I want to go into manufacturing. Any sort of advice that you would have for them as they're thinking about this, based on your experience and how you've been able to maneuver around and get so many different guys, I guess, roles that require different levels of expertise?
Yeah, I light up when you ask that because I say go for it, right?
Hmm.
I think it's expected that we're going to stay in a particular industry or type of role. The reality is, especially with procurement, and I even look at this from a direct, indirect perspective as well, right? That you should be able to do both. A lot of the fundamentals are the same. If I'm in semiconductors versus automotive versus consumer products, right? A lot of the issues are the same. So I think you have to be really adept at stating the fact that, you have vision to the greater landscape of the issues and how to be a problem solver and solutions provider, and you want to take those approaches from retail to automotive, right?
Hmm.
Because they're not doing anything different. It's not like there's a secret sauce in another organization that you don't have or another industry that's not being used in the other. They all come full circle. And I can absolutely attest to that. So I actually, when I'm hiring, I say I look for the best athlete, right? The best person who can take what they've learned and apply it in a variety of situations. Because why I went from engineering to supply management was because no 2 days have been the same in my entire career. So being able to apply those lessons learned in a variety of different places is really key for success.
Wonderful. All right. We are coming up on the end here, and I am trying to see if there's any other final pieces. Ralph, what's on the agenda next for you? And can we, it looks like maybe somebody's putting well, we'll try to get your LinkedIn out to everybody. If
Yeah.
somebody has Ralph's LinkedIn, if we can put that into the chat, that'd be great. So people have been asking some questions on how to connect with you. But Ralph, for you, what's next? Where are you headed next? Where can people either follow you? Tell us a little bit about the next step in your journey, whatever you want to leave people with that have attended this session today.
Sure. So first, thank you all for joining. I appreciate you taking the time out. What's next for me? You'll probably see me at ISM conference. So if anyone's attending that, absolutely, I'll be there. Um, um, I'll continue in my day job, just driving value for my organization and doing participating in opportunities like this, reaching out through various uh, networks to really share my experiences and help others get to where they want to go as a way to show my gratefulness for those who've done that for me in my past. Maybe Brandon will invite me back and we can talk about some other things so we can keep this going. I've done something similar with a few other ISM chapters and organizations. So that's the game plan.
I would love to have you back for a round two, Ralph, but this has been fantastic for today. Really want to thank you for joining. I was trying to get your LinkedIn pulled up so that I could send that out to people, but it seems that my computer's a little slow today. But needless to say, we'll make sure that we get you connected to everybody that attended. But I just want to say thank you so much for the very informational and exciting talk that we had today. Really love that you were able to come on and would love to see you back on maybe sometime next year or anytime in the near future. But thank you once again.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you so much, Brandon. Great work.
Thanks. Have a good day, everybody.